Okay, so I'm going to take you through the last two macroeconomic objectives, which is economic growth and equity in the distribution of income. This particular video will focus on economic growth in particular, right, which is chapter 11 in the textbook. And this is 11.1 specifically in the Eli Trugakis book. And in terms of your syllabus in the IB Economics Guide, it's 2.3 macroeconomic objectives. I'll just show you that. This is straight from the IB guide. So we're done with low unemployment, low and stable rate of inflation, uh, which dealt with the meaning of inflation, disinflation, deflation, consequences of inflation, deflation, the types and causes of inflation, possible relationships between unemployment and inflation. And now we're doing economic growth, which is a pretty small topic in terms of volume. It's not really a very heavy topic. It's really small and it's really fun and it's really applicable to everything that we're studying and seeing in the economy, especially in these difficult times. As we know, economic growth is really stalled at the moment because of COVID-19. We've been seeing that over the past few weeks. We've been discussing it, and I'm sure you're seeing that in many economies, right? So, this particular unit, we'll be looking at what is economic growth, causes of economic growth, and the consequences, right? So let's get straight to it. Okay. Right. So, what is economic growth? How would you define it? It's basically an increase in the total output of goods and services, or real GDP, in a nation over time. And it is achieved through the increase in the nation's aggregate demand and or its aggregate supply. Now, this aggregate supply will specifically be looking at long run aggregate supply. As I've always said, it's LRAS and then obviously SRAS as well. As a nation's output increases over time, the quantity and the quality of the goods and services available to the people of the nation increases. And when we look at this quantity and quality of goods and services, we also know that we're talking about resources and factors of production. So we will need to see this in an ADS diagram as well as a PPC. Right, so that short video, I think, makes it really clear the difference between real and nominal GDP and why we use real GDP. Okay, so this is the GDP of some countries. I know it's back in 2008, that's pretty old, but this is for Germany, India, Singapore, and Algeria. If you look at GDP versus GDP per capita. Now, what is the meaning of per capita? It's simply the GDP per person. So the GDP divided by the population will give us the GDP per capita. So if we look at the GDP of Germany, it's 2816, and the GDP of India was also 2816 back in 2008. But look at the staggering difference between the GDP per capita of both the countries, right? Again, you can see that difference over here, where Singapore has had a GDP that time of just 218 billion dollars, and the GDP per capita was 46,806, which again means less income inequality, right? So, a nation with a large GDP is not necessarily a rich nation. What matters is not the total output of goods and services in the economy, but the average output per person, which is given to us by the GDP per capita figure. Right. Now, why is the PPC so important to show us economic growth? When we studied the production possibilities curve, we saw that it shows combinations of maximum output that can be produced by an economy with fixed resources and technology, provided there is full or maximum employment of resources and productive efficiency, right? Using all the factors of production. Now, there is a difference between maximum employment and full employment. And the difference is just this much. When you're showing maximum employment, you can put any point on the PPC, gives us maximum employment. And full employment is shown through the potential output, right? Where you have a natural rate of unemployment as 5%. So that's your full employment of resources. This full employment is shown by an ADAS model, whereas maximum employment is shown can be shown by the PPC. So let's say we are looking at an economy which is producing two kinds of goods, capital goods and consumer goods. So when you want to draw PPC, you can take capital goods on either of the axes. We've taken it on the y-axis over here, and I've taken consumer goods on the x-axis. So let's assume that they can produce two types of goods with its resources, capital and consumer, right? Now, if it devotes all its resources to capital goods, it could produce a maximum of ym, and if it devotes all of its resources to consumer goods, it could produce a maximum of xm. So that's ym and xm, right? If the country is at point A on the PPC or the PPF, it's called the production possibilities curve or the production possibilities frontier. It's the same thing, just different terminologies. Frontier being kind of like a post, right? You can't cross through it because that's all the resources that you have. So that's why it's called a PPF. So now, if the country is at point A on the PPF, it can produce a combination of YO capital goods and XO consumer goods. If it reallocates its resources by moving around the PPC or the PPF from A to B, so that means it wants to produce more of consumer goods, it'll have to sacrifice some capital goods, right? So, at the expense of fewer capital goods, it can produce more consumer goods. So now it's producing X1 consumer goods, but fewer capital goods, so just Y1. So we can say that Y1 minus Y0, which is not producing now, is the opportunity cost of producing X1 minus XO consumer goods. Okay. Now, let's say that the economy, one economy, is producing inside the PPC, for example, point B. This simply means that the country is not using all of its resources. And let's say that it wants to produce at point C. It can only produce at point C, or any point for that matter outside the PPC, if it finds a way of expanding its resources or improves the productivity of those resources that it already has. As we know, the resources that it has, the factors of production, we call them cell. So that's capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor. So, if it improves the productivity of those resources that it has, this will push this PPC further outwards, or if it expands its resources. So, that means an increase in the quantity of the resources. So, this is, as we can see, this is the outward shift. Okay, so now the economy is producing X1. Sorry, I just wanted to go back. Okay, I just went back to this slide. Now, if we look at this particular slide over here, we can see that the particular economy has used its resources more efficiently, or has improved the quantity of the resources. Now, this could be more educated labor, for instance. It could be improved physical capital because they have better technology, or there's some great technological change. In terms of technological change, it's actually there in every economy every year in different industries, right? So that obviously leads to an outward shift. For example, let's talk about automation in agriculture. That is, it's a huge reason why PPCs shift outwards. Also, we can talk about, say, for instance, the in Greenland, we had these, in Iceland, we had these greenhouses. We have these greenhouses, which are used for growing vegetables and different kinds of food, right? And that is definitely a technological change. That's an improvement in productivity. And it's the fact that they can grow their own food without actually importing it and spending a lot of money. This will definitely push the PPC outwards. Okay, if you look at the business cycle, we have studied it already. This is the business cycle where you have, on the y axis, you can take the level of real output and chart it through time. Just quickly taking you through this, because this is where most of the economies are now. We are in a recession. A recession is simply defined as two consecutive quarters of declining national output. And if the economy contracts over a 6 month period, it is classified as a recession, right? It definitely impacts consumer and market confidence and will cause less economic activity. So even when we do get out from the lockdown, let's say we focus on Thailand. So Thailand's going to take time to get back to the get the consumer confidence back, right? So it's a tourism driven economy, and naturally this less economic activity is going to, result in a recession. Fewer workers are required to produce because less output is demanded. This particular crisis is more serious than the Great Recession. I'm sorry, yeah, the recession that happened in 2018, sorry, 2008. Uh, that's because um, That's because this particular crisis has affected both the supply side as well as the demand side of the economy. That was more demand side, but this is supply side too. And because of the less output being produced, obviously, we know labor is a derived demand. So if there is less demand for goods and services, there's less output being produced. You need less workers to produce it. And that's the reason why you have a record level of unemployment here in Thailand and obviously all over the world as well, because of this COVID-19 pandemic. So here we need policymakers to intervene to help the economy. A trough is the lowest point of a recession, and then it leads to a recovery. This is why most of the economists and starting from China and everywhere else around the world, they're saying that economies are going to bounce back and they're going to bounce back strong. It's all because of the business cycle and the fact that they believe that uh, it goes in cycles, right? We've already seen this. Now, I just wanted to compare the ADAS model with the PPC. So that's what we see over here. When we talk about short term economic growth, we know that that's because of aggregate demand. So let's say we're looking at an economy with a deflationary gap where its real output is at Y1 and not at the potential. So the economy is at point A. So, how do we show this on a PPC? We can show it at any point inside the PPC. It's perfectly fine to show that at this particular point, the resources are not being used efficiently, productive efficiency is not at its potential, right? And that's the reason why the economy is still operating at some point inside the PPC. And that is perfectly indicating a deflationary gap where the economy is not producing at its potential, right? Again, be reminded here that when we talk about the YP or the YFE over here, it does not correspond with a point on the PPC. These are two different things because a point on the PPC is talking about maximum employment of all the resources. But we know that when we look at potential output, we're talking about some level of unemployment in the economy, which is the natural rate of unemployment, which we say it's around 5% over here, right? So these are two different things. Okay, if there's an increase in aggregate demand, there will be a shift in the aggregate demand rightwards, seen over here, and the economy is moving from point A to point B. Now, how do you show that on your PPC? You can show it as moving from point A to point B, but not really coming on to the PPC. So, this is a beautiful diagram to show this side by side that it's increasing and it's moving closer and closer to maximum employment of resources, and it's probably at full employment of resources, where in this diagram you can see that AD2 SRAS and LRAS are all intersecting at the point B, which shows us that it's at potential output, right? So you can show these two diagrams side by side and they show us short-term economic growth. Um, Increases in either C, I, G, or X minus M, which are all our components of aggregate demand, cause it to shift from 81 to 82, resulting in short run equilibrium levels of output beyond the full employment level. Okay, so this is when aggregate demand is continuing to grow. So we showed it from a deflationary gap moving to potential, and what if aggregate demand constantly grows? Then there'll be an inflationary gap, right? That results in demand pull inflation. We can show it even on the Keynesian model, where you see that there is a shift from 81 to 82, there's no inflation. 82 to 81, there is inflation, but there is also economic growth. And then from 83 to 84, we see that there's no economic growth and there's just inflation. So, relatively small increase in output comes at the cost of high inflation. Okay, long term economic growth, how do you show that? You show that through a shift in the LRAS, right? So when LRAS is shifting rightwards, then you can show the outward shift of the PPC from PPC 1 to PPC 2, and both of these will correspond to long term economic growth. So these are two slides which you can use very well. In fact, this one this one, and this one to demonstrate how the PPC and the ADS are connected to one another to show economic growth. And that ties in very well with our objectives over here. I constantly go back to these because these are our learning objectives um, for the syllabus, and these are the kind of things that you will be questioned about, right? So the factors that cause economic growth: increased resource quantity, improved resource quality, technological change. Now, all these three things lead to an outward PPC shift because that's an increase in production possibilities, right? And if there's improved efficiency and there's reduced unemployment, that would also cause growth. And institutional changes, that is, changes made by the government in terms of policies, etc., is also going to lead to economic growth. Now, this improved efficiency and reduced unemployment can be shown as a movement of production point closer to PPC because you're not actually adding any more resources, you're just improving the efficiency of those resources. Okay? And all types of unemployment gets reduced. But when we talk about the ADAS model, we are just showing natural unemployment getting reduced and not all types. There can also be a decrease in production possibilities due to inefficient use of the resources, decrease in productivity. So, that outward shift can also lead to an inward shift. So, that's also a possibility. And there can always be non parallel shifts of the PPC outwards. This means that, let's say, we're talking about X over here being consumer goods and Y over here being capital goods. So, if there are more resources used for the production of consumer goods, so the shift outwards will be more broader towards the consumer goods and narrower towards the capital goods. Okay, we also have an objective here about productivity, which says explain the importance of improved productivity for economic growth. So now, why is productivity important and what is productivity? It refers to the amount of output attributable to each unit of input. If you remember, we studied it in micro as well, productivity, when we were studying the theory of the firm. But in terms of the working population, because now we're taking it in a macro context, so productivity is the quantity of output produced for each hour of work, measured as real GDP divided by the total number of hours worked. And it's an important source of growth, as the more productive a nation's resources like land, labor, and capital, the more output and income can be generated on a per capita basis. So, what are the sources of growth? There are basically three: physical capital, human capital, and natural. Some of the sources of productivity growth are: the first one is human capital. Sorry, I don't know why it has gotten this way. This is the this is the capital that you're most familiar with, that is physical capital, which is basically human made resources employed in the production of goods and services like factories, robots, computers, buildings, tools, any kind of machinery or equipment that is being used to produce goods and services uh, is physical capital. Higher national levels of private investment increase the quantity and the quality of physical capital. It makes workers productive. It leads to long run economic growth. Increase in the quality of capital and technology also leads to vast improvements in worker productivity and therefore higher rates of growth. Okay, then we have human capital, which refers to the value of labor created through education, training, knowledge, and health. Can even mention skills over here. So it's education, skills, training, knowledge, and health. And as Julian Simon said, adding more people to any community causes problems, but they're also the means to solve these problems, right? Okay, natural capital is everything under land plus everything on land plus the ecosystem of a country, which includes marketable commodities like mineral deposits, metals, oils, natural gas, timber, coal. If you think about it, many of the countries like United States, African countries, India, there are lots of developed countries, but also more so developing and underdeveloped countries or LEDCs that have a lot of marketable commodities. Marketable commodities are basically commodities that you can buy and sell, right? So ideally, these nations should be really, really rich. So now, while we say US is the world's largest economy, you definitely can't say the same about, say, Africa. But that doesn't mean that they were short of these things. So is it really necessary that an economy needs to have marketable commodities in order to grow? Not really, right? Another thing is ecological resources. This is really, really important. We spoke about common access resources, we spoke about rivers and oceans, forests, soil, air, wildlife, climate, biodiversity, and ozone. These are all really, really important for sustainable development. If these are cared for and if there is investment in them and they're productive, right? So they can definitely lead to more economic growth. Okay, now that we're done with all of the topics of the meaning and the causes, now let's look at the consequences of economic growth. This is just a summary of the consequences. I'll just take you through them very quickly, and then we'll divide them into positive and negative consequences, right? So there's basically an increase in the average level of income and consumption, externalities, inflation, resource depletion, structural unemployment, composition of output, unequal income distribution, and effect on the balance of payments. Okay, I just basically read out the slide, but let's go on to the positive consequences, which I think will be better for you to understand it. Now, it may be assumed that, on the whole, in the absence of periodic recessions, aggregate demand tends to increase steadily as population size and incomes grow. So, as these populations grow, as incomes grow, there's going to be an increase in aggregate demand, so a shift from AD1 to AD2. Now, without supply side improvements to shift out LRAS, AD would increase more than AS and there would be inflation. We already saw that in the previous slides. However, when economic growth occurs, pushing out the LRAS curve. So, when we're not just talking about short term economic growth, but when we're talking about long term economic growth, where there's a shift in the LRAS outwards, economies can experience non inflationary growth, as you can see over here. So, from A to B, the economy has gone, and there is basically no inflation, right? It's still at this particular price level. So, um, that's a hugely positive consequence of economic growth, especially when we talk about it in the long term. And that happens through supply side policies, as we studied. So, supply side policies and the growth that they bring about result in lower unemployment. Obviously, if there's more output in the economy, you need more workers to produce that output. So, there will be lower unemployment and there's downward pressure on the price level, right? The result could be the following: higher living standards. Definitely, you would have higher living standards with economic growth. People are able to afford a lot more because of the incomes. There'll be improved technology. Like I spoke to you about agriculture, that's again improved technology. And there are so many countries, USA being a case in point, where farmers are using such improved technology and such groundbreaking technology, in fact, that has only been possible because of economic growth. So we can say that improved technology is both a cause of economic growth as well as a consequence of economic growth. With economic growth and with more incomes comes more tax revenues. Now, you can look at this tax revenues in terms of tax revenues which you're getting from income tax, which the government gets in terms of income taxes, and also in terms of consumption taxes, right? So, when there's economic growth, people do a lot more spending and they have to paid taxes for that spending. So there's definitely an increased tax revenue, and that tax revenue can also be a cause for more economic growth. That's because we are speaking about these supply side policies, right? So the supply side policies also have investment as a key factor. So that increased tax revenue can be used to invest. Okay, if we look at the facilities uh, that are there in developed countries, in developed economies, and even if we look at developing economies, Thailand, for instance, Bangkok, for instance, you've got these beautiful temples, you've got beautiful public spots. Now, all of these public places, where has the money come from? It has come from tax revenue because it's a major source. And that economic growth is evident in the city because of the fact that, there have been more tax revenues, there have been more incomes, there's been more employment, and that's the reason why there are more tax revenues. The international context, I think I'll come back to that later because we will do international economics, and that's something that we can discuss later. In fact, economic growth ties in very nicely with international and development economics. And yes, a level of education would increase in the economy because of economic growth. And if there's more education, that does mean higher levels of democracy and freedom because people just, get more thinking. They start to think about things, and they start to think about how they can make the economy better, for instance, right? But not surprisingly, economic growth comes with a lot of negative consequences, right? An increase in income is not necessarily equivalent to increased happiness, right? It may be argued that the conclusion leads to higher incomes, which results in higher standards of living, is flawed, making use of some controversial assumptions. So, for example, less leisure time and neglect of personal relationships. The most pertinent example at this point of time that I can think of is our current lockdown situation because of COVID 19. Economic growth has come to a halt in so many countries all around the globe. And due to that, you have people who are spending time at home because of the lockdown. They can't go out. This was forced upon everyone. This is a major supply shock. This is a major shock in the economy, due to which people are forced to stay at home. And because they now have more time at home, I'm sure you can also feel the effects as students. You can see it in your home with your parents having more time on their hands. You must be spending more time with your parents, you must be spending more time with your family, and you should be seeing that. I think it's very evident that in general people have more leisure time, right? Just look at the amount of videos that have increased online. I've got so many friends who've been telling me, okay, let's do this TikTok video. I say, I don't have the patience to learn that. I'd rather learn one more tool to teach my students. But yeah, lots of leisure time. And there's a neglect of personal relationships when it comes to economic growth, because usually, especially if we talk about households where you have both the parents working, or the kids are really really small, you'd see that those relationships get affected. Even if the kids aren't small, and you have parents and households which they don't have time, or they have to leave people in with a caregiver, leave their children with a caregiver. Again, how good is that? How healthy is that, right? So that's definitely a negative consequence of just running behind so-called money. Yeah. Another negative consequence is it leads to a lot of structural changes. Now, we've discussed this multiple times in the classroom that economic growth is always bringing about with it structural changes. So a change from a primary sector economy to a secondary sector to then a tertiary sector economy. Those are like structural changes, and it does bring with it unemployment for the workers who get redundant, right, who lose their jobs. Now, those laid off workers have to get trained, they have to get educated, they have to restart their life, and those structural changes aren't always um, productive for a long period of time. They might lead to better consequences in the near future or maybe in the late future, whatever it is. But there's a period of time when you have all these people who are laid off, and you have unemployed people who are actually looking for jobs, and then they can't find enough jobs. And look at the environment, right? The less, I mean, you just look around you. Just yesterday, that is on the 20th of April, you had the environment of. I read in the news that Bangkok has its cleanest air in a very long time. Look at the changes in the environment because of everyone being locked down at home. Um, there's just these wonderful pictures that have come up on the internet. You just look outside your balcony. My God, such a big change, right? So these are the negative consequences of um, economic growth, and this positives and these negatives and these consequences, they're always very good evaluation. So what kind of points can you use for your evaluation is that deflationary gaps or output gaps may be the result of a fall and economic growth or negative economic growth in the short run, and may be solved using demand management, because this is what you'll have to evaluate, that how can you actually solve this problem. This is really really good for your um, commentaries as well, because if you have an article where you're looking at deflationary gap or an output gap or negative economic growth, so then you're talking about demand management or expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, and they may narrow the fluctuations in economic activity, which is shown on the business cycle diagram. So you can always use a business cycle diagram in your commentary as well. The trend growth line shown on the business cycle diagram is influenced by the supply side policies that generate long term economic growth. As we know, the trend line in the business cycle, so the trend line that we have, that is the potential GDP. So that's the supply side, right? And you should be able to evaluate the consequences of both demand and supply side policies in terms of their likely success in achieving their goals, their appropriateness in different situations, the consequences for different stakeholders, and the possible trade offs that occur in the pursuit of different goals. So, these are the four uh, sort of areas where you can evaluate the consequences of both demand and supply side policies. Let me know if you need any more help with that. So, maybe I can make a separate video just to explain those. Okay, for the HL students, you'll need to calculate economic growth. So this is basically the formula of the growth rate. It varies from country to country. Positive growth rate indicates that the total output of goods and services has increased from one year to the next. And negative is the evidence of recession caused by either decrease in AD or a decrease in AS. And the formulae, nominal GDP, we've already seen this in a previous chapter. Nominal GDP is the total value of output of several products, and the nominal GDP growth rate is the same way. Real GDP is nominal GDP into the CPI, divided by the CPI into zero point 0.01. CPI index is the price of B2 divided by the price of B1 into 100. B is nothing but the basket of goods and services, and the real GDP growth rate is real GDP 2 minus real GDP 1 upon real GDP 1 into 100. These are some of the formulae. The interesting point to note here is consumption versus investment. Now, capital goods production needs investment, which comes from saving, sacrificing consumption to build capital for future economic growth. So, consumption is also a component of your aggregate demand, and investment is also a component of your aggregate demand, right? But when we talk about investment, we know that investment is fueled by savings. If there are no savings, then there cannot be investment, right? So, in order to save, you will have to decrease some amount of spending. Okay, so consumption sacrifice is the opportunity cost for higher future production possibilities. This is a really important and really interesting topic, actually. More than being important, it's so interesting. And I've linked a few videos here. Just take a look at this, and next week we'll have a discussion on this particular topic, and I'll be using it as a formative as well. So that's it for this topic on economic growth.